Thank you so much, and we will start with your lecture, please.
Yes, I had expected that there would be a screen with my lecture projected on it in Hebrew. It is there. Good. Because I did not make any slides because I thought it would be on the screen, which it is. I'll read through my paper as you have it in Hebrew. But first of all, perhaps I should say thank you very much for those two very interesting, thoughtful introductions to our subject for this conference. They raise a lot of issues, and I don't think I'm the person to be able to solve all those issues. Contrary to what Simi was saying, I'm not Einstein and I'm not Freud. But here's what I think. Excuse me. In one of his introductory lectures, Freud discussed analytic therapy, and in particular, he wanted to distinguish psychoanalysis from hypnotic suggestion. And here's what he says. The doctor, as the hypnotist, has no difficulty, of course, in making the patient a supporter of some particular theory, and in thus making him share some possible error of his own. In this respect, the patient is behaving like anyone else, like a pupil. But this only affects his intelligence, not his illness. But in psychoanalysis, the analyst seeks something else, not to convince the patient of anything, but to make a specific kind of connection. After all, this again is Freud in the same chapter. After all, the patient's conflicts will only be successfully solved and his resistances overcome if the anticipatory ideas, Freud meant the interpretation, the patient is given, tally with what is real in him. So Freud is trying to point towards a specific moment of engagement which can enliven the patient with the analyst's thinking and experience. So the analyst has to point not to his own theories or opinions, he has to point to the patient's conflicts. The interpretation must connect with the patient's libidinal conflicts. Now, as you may know, Adolf Grünbaum took up this tally principle, as Grünbaum called it, the tallying with something in the patient. And he attempted to show that Freud did not observe it rigorously. However, psychoanalysts have been loyal to the general idea, and we are on the whole aware of becoming, when we become intellectual in the session, often with the patient's encouragement. And it is tempting to go along that intellectual path and find that we feel satisfied when our interpretation tallies with something in us, that is, with our own theories. It is probably the case that we tend to do that frequently. It feels much safer if we keep securely on our own base, our metapsychology. Analysts tend to be well educated and of high intelligence. We like intellectual puzzles, and they can be much easier to solve than facing something that is emotionally ugly in our patients and then feeling ugly in ourselves. As Freud said, we must aim our interest at the suffering and not at being intelligent. Well, 70 years after Freud's comment, Elizabeth Spilius researched a sample of cases written by young analysts, and she concluded, I quote again, "An analyst who made interpretations in terms of verbal and behavioral content seen in a rigidly symbolic form now seems likely to have been detrimental to the recognition of alive moments of emotional contact." I took it that the alive moments of emotional contact occurred when an interpretation tallied, as Freud said, with something in the patient. So it was Spilius's comment which provoked and inspired my book, Countertransference and Alive Moments. The crucial moment is when something comes emotionally alive in the connection between analyst and patient. I make a distinction between intellectual and emotional connections, just as Freud contrasted intelligence with illness. It leads to some questions. And there are three here. What is the characteristic of an interpretation that tallies with something in the patient and brings a spark of life to the moment? How does an analyst develop such an interpretation in his mind? How does one tell if an interpretation has brought something to life at a moment in the analysis? Spilius's comment implied a difference between an interpretation in the form of rigid symbols and theories and an interpretation that touches on something different, needs to tally with something in the patient. So I should like to describe in this lecture now how this might play out in practice in the clinical setting. First, I will describe a case in a paper by Ron Britton and John Steiner, two Kleinian analysts in Britain. Then a brief demonstration by Betty Joseph, who was an inspirational teacher of many of us, including Britton and Steiner. And then a brief piece of my own material. I wanted to describe something that is called the selected fact. In the paper by Britton and Steiner, there is at first an interpretation which does not bring a live moment. And this is followed by reflection and an eventual live moment. They acknowledged we can frequently get an intellectual agreement. Agreement with the analyst may be an expression of compliance, and disagreement may be a protest about a correct but painful or provocative realization. And they follow Bion's interest in the selected fact. Bion frequently referred to Poincaré, the philosopher-scientist who had used the term selected fact. And I'll give this a slightly long quote from Poincaré, which was an inspiration for Bion. If a new result, he's talking about scientific discovery, not psychoanalytic. If a new result is to have any value, it must unite elements long since known, but till then scattered and seemingly foreign to each other, and suddenly introduce order where the appearance of disorder reigned. Then it enables us to see at a glance each of these elements in the place it occupies in the whole, Not only is the new fact valuable on its own account, but it alone gives a value to the old facts it unites. Our mind is frail, as our senses are. It would lose itself in the complexity of the world if that complexity were not harmonious. Like the short-sighted, it would only see the details and would be obliged to forget each of these details before examining the next, because it would be incapable of taking in the whole. The only facts worthy of our attention are those which introduce order into this complexity and so make it acceptable to us. It's a process which I guess we're all familiar with. It's both intellectual and also inspirational. The facts are held in mind, but some unseen process draws them together in a pattern. It has an unconscious dimension which delivers the answer all of a sudden. It may even be presented to one's consciousness in a dream. Excuse me. For an instance, there's the famous dream of Kekule, which the dream presented to him the image for the structure of the benzene ring. You remember maybe 6 snakes, each swallowing the tail of another snake in a ring, which then gave him the idea that benzene is a ring of carbon atoms, each one linked to the next carbon atom in a ring. A very important chemical advance, I think. Bion himself was interested in this inspirational moment arising from a piece of unconscious work. However, he did not acknowledge the intellectual collection of facts, and in fact he prescribed abolishing memory and desire. As Mawson, excuse me, Chris Mawson, who made the collection of Bion's works, which were published 5 years ago or so, Mawson commented, it is more akin to a sudden recalled dream which swims into view. For this phenomenon, Bion used the term evolution. That inspirational moment when the answer swims into view can be obstructed by too much theorizing and intellectualizing. Now we have to wait for this selected fact. Psychoanalysis has accumulated a very considerable amount of metapsychology over a century or more, and it can be hard work to brush it aside. Bion himself, back in his medical school days, described one of his teachers, Wilfrid Trotter. Trotter listened with, this is Bion describing this rather later in an autobiographical piece of writing. Trotter listened with unassumed interest as if the patient's contributions flowed from the fount of knowledge itself. It took me years of experience before I learned that this was in fact the case. But he, Bion, did eventually learn it. Perhaps he learned also from Melanie Klein in his own analysis with her. She says, in the recently published lectures on technique, these are notes which she used for teaching candidates at the time that Bion was a candidate. And she said, if we are not bent on labeling our patients as such and such a type, or wondering prematurely about the structure of the case, if we are not guided in our approach to him by any preconceived plan, trying to evoke such and such response from him, then, and only then, are we ready to learn step by step about the patient from himself. So this is the struggle we have, to listen without preconceived plans. We often fail, and it is true that Bion himself became extremely theoretical at times, and no doubt Klein did as well. But we have the ideal, to learn everything about the patient from himself. Now, apart from the selected fact, there is an alternative called the overvalued idea, which Britton and Steiner used. They retained the term selected fact for this unconscious pulling together of disparate elements of the analysis, and they contrasted it with the overvalued idea and meant instead listening into their own theories in the material. That's the overvalued idea. The analyst can often stick to his own theories as a drowning man clings to a lifebelt. We can all feel we are drowning in material which we do not fully understand. And so metapsychology can come to our rescue. And we rescue ourselves by offering possible interpretations on the basis of our intellect and intelligence. Now, their paper, as Britton and Steiner, demonstrates these intellectual overvalued ideas as much as the selected fact. Now, looking at their clinical material, they describe a patient who was a rather obsessional man, who was sensitive and paranoid about the assessments that he got in his work and about being criticized in general. Now they write, one day he began a session describing how he had been attacked by his girlfriend for impulsively buying a suit. He felt guilty because he had not taken her with him, which he had explained was because it was the last day of a sale, so he had been unable to arrange a time which would accommodate her. The problem of waiting had come up in the analysis previously, and the analyst interpreted in this way. I interpreted that he seemed to have great difficulty waiting, so that acting impulsively helped him to avoid waiting. He asked if I had said waking or waiting. And I noticed this misunderstanding. That was the interpretation of the analyst. Now, although the analyst noted the misunderstanding, he did not interpret it, and perhaps had not understood it immediately. So, continuing the description in their paper, the analyst went on to suggest that the patient's preoccupation with attacks and persecution gave him something to occupy his mind while he was waiting. The analyst added that there was something anal in the way he controlled his objects during the waiting, and linked this with his preoccupation with money. Well, this reference to the anal preoccupation does seem theoretical and even overconfident, perhaps. In fact, the analyst confides that he was himself actually uncomfortable about his interpretation and realized that the query about waking or waiting indicated it was probably not on the patient's mind. Clearly, the analyst was on the wrong track, not touching something in the patient. We do make mistakes, and probably quite often, and this is important to accept, but it does have consequences. The initial material about his girlfriend's criticism had now been superseded by the mistake, and a new situation had occurred. The analyst himself felt uncomfortable, and the patient queried the words used, waiting or waking. However, not uncommonly, the patient or his unconscious keeps trying. And again, from the paper, the patient responded by describing an incident a few days previously when he had waited for his girlfriend upstairs at the theatre. He was sure she was late and doubted if she would come at all after her anger with him over the suit. But it turned out that she was actually waiting for him downstairs in the bar. So you see, the analyst had understood something of what was happening, because he then said, "I think you are commenting on my interpretation. You seem to feel that we are in different places. My interpretation did not reach where you were, and perhaps you felt it was something I was preoccupied with, so that you are suspicious of it." Well, this seems an important understanding. The analyst had been in the wrong place and made an incorrect interpretation, and because of his previous uncertainty, he had made a theoretical interpretation of anal impulses, which did not tally with the patient at that moment. The material is a nice indication of how an analyst can be in the wrong mental place for the patient. Wrong though the interpretation was, perhaps it was for understandable reasons. Now they go on to describe how the next day the patient returned to the question about waiting. But eventually the patient described his real fear was being put into a mental straitjacket. He described this in relation to his workplace, but it seems clearly relevant to the analysis as well. In this short interaction, it seems clear that the analyst and patient had enacted, without realizing, a scene in which a kind of intellectual straitjacket was applied to the patient. The analyst's preconceived ideas about waiting and the anal frustrations. It's now important to recognize that with the cooperation of the patient, or with the cooperation of the patient's unconscious, the analyst did have the opportunity to be on the same track, and his mental processes could tally with the patient's. That is about the straitjacket. And probably the resort to intellect and theory in search of certainty may be a major factor. Then, incidentally, we may as a result have to move to interpretations about what the patient thinks about an analyst who makes mistakes and what has happened to the analyst. The limitation of the paper is the relative lack of attention to the emotional experience of the analyst, his countertransference. He did acknowledge his concern at the stilted nature of his interpretation and the correspondence between the uncertainty in the analyst and the patient's understanding of a word, waking or waiting, could have been significant. In other words, a connection between the analyst's emotional countertransference, uncertainty, and an emotion indicated in the material could be a good indicator of how to capture the next interpretation. At least it would have been an indicator if it were not so difficult to capture one's own feelings and their significance from moment to moment. I mean, I'm saying it's very difficult, isn't it, to catch these things at the moment that they are happening. Nevertheless, this correspondence of countertransference with a similar indication in the material gives a pointer to our next interpretation. However, having made a mistake, we need to be aware that we cannot simply correct it. There is a situation now when the patient is confronted with an analyst who has made a mistake. That is, then, that the something in the patient that needs an interpretation, that is, then, the something in the patient that then needs an interpretation to tally with it. As an aside, Steiner described that new interpretation in another paper as an analyst-centered interpretation, one which is opposed to what he called a patient-centered interpretation, focusing on what is happening in the patient's mind. In other words, the patient has his own interpretation of the analyst. The analyst needs now to follow the patient's thought that he was forced into a theoretical straitjacket by the analyst. Well, I want to continue the point here about the countertransference. The analyst is uncertain about his work, although there's some reality that much of the time we cannot always be certain. However, very often self-doubt in the analyst fits with the patient's own anxious doubt and sense of being criticized. One could, in a Kleinian way, see this countertransference as a replica in the analyst of the patient's own self-doubt. But it is a projection into the analyst's self-criticism. In other words, there's a correspondence between them, an emotional connection of an unconscious kind. The patient's sensitivity to failings being pointed out in his assessments at work corresponds to the analyst's uncertainty about his work. The analyst's uncertainty is indeed an opportunity for the patient's projection. Of course, this is complex and is difficult to grasp in the moment when it happens, and especially when it is a painful experience for both. As the authors of this paper wrote, a sudden precipitating intuition in the analyst may be the harbinger, the awareness of insight. However, its arrival can also resemble the emergence of delusional certainty, the difference between a creative use of a selected fact or the crystallization of an overvalued idea, which may not be immediately evident. In the case we just followed, the uncertainty immediately after the first interpretation, expressed by the patient as querying a word, waiting or waking, was noted, but not understood by the analyst at the time. It could have alerted the analyst to the importance of uncertainty, about the meaning to be interpreted, and also about the confusion over waiting for the girlfriend. That correspondence could have been a significant connection. Firstly, the correspondence between two things. The analyst's emotional countertransference and an emotional indicated in the material, which is similar, could have been a good indicator for the next interpretation. At least it would have been if it were not so difficult to pick it up in the moment-to-moment interaction. And I developed the importance of this kind of connection between the countertransference and the actual material. I developed the importance of this in my book, called Research on the Couch, which published a bit before the Countertransference and the Live Moments book. Now let me illustrate a similar importance of the analyst's intuitive use of his own state of mind. In a paper on handling anxiety, Betty Joseph observes the obvious. Patients inevitably search for relief from their anxieties. So it puts them in a conflict. In part, they want to understand their conflicts and anxieties. But their other motive is to defend against them and to seek a support from the analyst for those defenses. Often we do unwittingly give support, which Joseph describes as being used by our patients. And she says, this is in the paper on handling anxiety, I want to start by looking at the way in which patients use us analysts to help them with anxiety. And she reviews a few ways in which this happens, but here is one of her examples. Patient A begins a session by telling me that once again he has been extremely nasty with his wife on the previous night, and he enumerates a series of apparently unkind, intolerant things that he has done and his wife's responses. It sounds from this that he might be experiencing what we could call superego anxiety. That is, guilt about what he's done, and a desire to get the analyst to understand and explain the reasons for his behavior. Or he might be speaking about his anxiety about his wife and her ruthlessness and the bad state of the marriage. That is it depression, sorrow, and guilt that he's talking about? Or persecution and hatred? Or is he telling me about the failure of my work, that once again he's had one of these rows? Or is it to be understood as an acting out from the relationship with the analyst? Actually, she says, from my sense of what was going on, from the way that the patient was talking, and the atmosphere that was being created in the session, it seemed to me that the most important aspect was the patient's attempt to involve me in a kind of verbal, sadomasochistic beating of himself. I was being invited to join in by being interpretively condemning or critical. We can review all sorts of possible interpretations of the nature of the anxiety, as Joseph did. But she says the key deciding factors is the analyst's intuitive sense of what is going on. It is not directly in the material, not in the words. She gained a sense of what was most important from her experience in herself. Now, just one more example. I hope I'm not going on too long. Probably am. I exemplify this with one midweek session of a middle-aged man who was difficult to engage with and, in fact, occasionally went literally to sleep in the sessions, lying on the couch. Only infrequently could we get a sense of engagement together. And again, this is an attempt to convey a process of the non-contact followed by the possibility of a moment of contact and engagement. Now, I'm just reading my notes that I've written after this because this is some time ago. He, the patient, told me of a meeting he had with a friend with whom he was working on a project. The friend did very little towards the project, rarely contributed what he had agreed to do, and was in fact a very unreliable man. However, my patient was extraordinarily fond of and loyal to this friend. On this occasion, I found myself thinking, what an unreliable patient I had, who at times would literally go to sleep on the project I was conducting with him. I felt a mixture of irritation that I was struggling so much to try and make headway with his analysis. I interpreted this a little mechanically along these lines. I compared how we both struggled to keep a project going, him with his friend and I with him. He was silent, in fact, a common response from him. And then he started snoring, also common. So no sign of an alive moment in that. There was, on my part, a mechanical interpretation of the verbal content. And I'll just mention the interpretation had the quality of what one of my supervisors long before when I was training told me was a you mean me transference interpretation. That meant the mechanical quality of translating the content of the associations onto the alternative figure of the analyst. Our question now would be, what happened to the analyst that he used a mechanical mode of thinking? He too was not alive and contributed his share of the dead mechanical quality to the moment. In the actual session, the process seemed aimed at moving away from the alive irritation. This entailed taking the content and substituting different figures into the narrative described, just as Freud had done 100 years before in his thematic analysis of his own dreams. It points strongly towards the fact that a simple content analysis is in fact too simple. What is the missing ingredient? The deadness appears to be the analyst's lack of alertness to the connection between them. But what prompted him to go in this incorrect direction? The analyst was irritated, and in my description conveyed a sense of hopelessness with this man. That was my sense. It might be supposed, I think, that with charity, the analyst did his best to just keep going. And what that meant was that he avoided the irritation. In that moment, perhaps, irritation was the missing liveliness. And the patient's response of going silent and then snoring indicated very clearly a lack of life at that moment. So I decided this was a failed interpretation. If the interpretation had been correct, I would have expected an unconscious change in the struggle in the analysis, both less irritation and my countertransference, and actual material that suggested more cooperation. That prediction clearly had not happened. Then, continuing when he woke, he remembered what he had been talking about and the interpretation, and he courteously acknowledged the link I had made. I felt he was reassuring me and even patronizing me a little. He continued to tell me how he had worked with his friend all evening and well into the night, whilst, interestingly, the friend had eventually gone off to bed. And he explained how the friend needed a lot of encouragement and reassurance. And the patient's own role was to be very tolerant whilst he did most of the work for the colleague. Whilst I was thinking about his reassuring me, he remembered my interpretation, and he continued and told me how his friend needed so much reassurance and encouragement. Then I could see another double story. First, in the countertransference, I felt I was being encouraged to do better. And the second version of the story was encouraging the patient's material about encouraging his friend. So the countertransference and the material matched. So, continuing with the notes, then I interpreted that he was trying to tell me that he felt he had to be very tolerant of my limited abilities to contribute to the analysis in the way he had experienced and needed. Yet I said he felt very loyal to me and he had to keep things going. So what was his response to that? In fact, he did not go to sleep. He changed the subject and said he had been very interested in 2 insects flying in the room where he had been working, and he'd been trying to estimate the difference in the buzz of each, which gave him some thoughts about the project he was working on. It was a musical project. I was heartened by his change of topic, as it made me think that something was moving on. What I thought was that we can see in the countertransference that I was feeling more heartened and felt a more hopeful situation. At least he was not asleep. And the material, in the material, it was a story of 2 insects buzzing together. So here was a significant change. The narrative of a lack of cooperation had moved towards a narrative of cooperation, the 2 insects buzzing around together. Now, well, just finally, there are dead and unconvincing moments in the contact with patients, and there are moments that feel much more lively as if we are moving on. And I suggest that the latter tend to be moments when something the analyst says tallies with something the patient feels, perhaps unconsciously for both of them. This applies whether there is irritation or hope. The correspondence is emotional and not merely cognitive. This correspondence, however, could be interrupted and obstructed by a concentration on analytic theories. Metapsychology has an importance, but it can also be a resistance, the analyst's resistance. I drew attention many years ago to similar correspondences in patient and analyst. I suggested in a paper on psychodynamic formulation and assessments for psychotherapy that we assess whether there is a correspondence from 3 perspectives. First, a narrative in the material about the conscious problems, then a narrative in the emotional countertransference to the patient in the assessment, and thirdly, a narrative in the history of the patient's childhood, as remembered at least by the patient. When all 3 narratives begin to overlap or coincide, then there seems likely to be a valid formulation. Thus, we need to compare the patient's history with the current life situation and with the story played out in the transference and countertransference. Then we could predict that some core element or unconscious fantasy in the patient's personality and his relationships may be touched and come to life by the analyst describing the narratives from the 3 perspectives. I don't claim this is the last word on live moments, but I hope it could be a stimulus for more interest in capturing that difference between those deadening moments and the more emotional living moments. Above all, we need to assess our interpretations of the unconscious in terms of the response to it, whether a dead intellectual evaluation by the patient of the interpretation or a moment of live connection. Thank you very much.